The year was 1928. Winter had tightened its grip on a remote Canadian village tucked deep between endless forests and frozen rivers. Snow piled high against crooked rooftops, smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the rhythm of life carried on as it always had, slow, steady, and unremarkable. Yet one morning, that quiet rhythm was gone, replaced with something far more sinister. Silence, confusion, and the chilling realization that time itself had stopped. It was the village baker who first noticed. He rose before dawn, as he did every morning, to heat his ovens and prepare loaves for the townsfolk. But as he reached for his pocket watch to check the hour, his hand froze. The watch had stopped, its delicate hands locked forever at 3:12 a.m. He shook it, wound it, pressed it to his ear. Nothing. Just stillness. Annoyed, he stepped into his shop where the wall clock ticked above the door, only to find its pendulum frozen mid-swing, the brass weight dangling like a body in suspension. By sunrise, the entire town had noticed the same impossible phenomenon. The teacher's wristwatch, the pastor's grand oak clock, the station master's railway timer, even children's cheap tin toys, all had frozen at the exact same moment. Not a single timepiece survived. It was as if for one instant the very heartbeat of the world had been cut short, and the village alone had felt the blade. At first, the explanations were simple. Perhaps it was the cold, villagers whispered. Perhaps some storm in the night had sent a strange magnetic current across the valley. But unease spread quickly as word traveled from home to home. These were not electric clocks, not fragile machines. They were wind-up, spring-driven, pendulum-based, all different makes and models, yet all of them had stopped with a precision too sharp to ignore. The blacksmith, a rational man, stormed into the square with his heavy iron clock. He smashed it open before the crowd, gears spilling into the snow like silver guts. Nothing was broken, nothing was jammed, and yet it refused to move. His wife fainted at the sight. Then came the stories. Those who had been awake at 3:12 claimed they had felt a pressure in the air, like the weight of a thunderstorm without the storm itself. One farmer described hearing a sound like glass shattering across the sky, followed by a silence so suffocating he thought he'd gone deaf. Another, a young mother, swore she had seen a figure standing in the snow outside her window, unmoving, faceless, watching. By noon, panic gripped the village. Children clung to their parents, shopkeepers shut their doors, neighbors gathered in the church praying for an explanation. But none came. Instead, the people stared at their useless watches, the frozen hands locked on that cursed number, 3:12. What had happened in that single minute of the night? Why had the world stopped? And why had it only stopped here? The villagers could not know that this was just the beginning. By the second day, disbelief had settled into the marrow of the village. People who had lived their entire lives by the tick of a clock now found themselves staring at lifeless faces of glass and brass, waiting for them to move. But they never did. Every clock remained frozen at 3:12 a.m., a time etched into the minds of all who saw it. The first suspicions were practical. Some blamed the cold. Northern winters were notorious for breaking machines, and it seemed logical, at least at first, that a sudden snap of frost had stopped their delicate workings. But the blacksmith, the watchmaker, and even the schoolteacher dismantled their clocks piece by piece, studying the gears under candlelight. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was frozen. The mechanisms should have turned. They simply refused. Others whispered about electricity, though the village had none. There were no power lines here, no buzzing wires, no great stations to fail. Every timepiece was mechanical, hand-wound, reliant on springs and pendulums, yet all had surrendered to the same moment, as though commanded by an unseen hand. A few villagers insisted it must have been a trick, perhaps orchestrated by mischief-makers. But who among them could have entered every home in the middle of the night, tampered with every device, and done so with such precision? The thought dissolved quickly into laughter, though the laughter never lasted long. By the third evening, unease had sharpened into fear. People began to notice other oddities. Candles burned strangely short that night, as though hours had gone missing. Chickens refused to lay their eggs, Cows stood restless in their stalls, their eyes wide, their breathing shallow. Dogs barked endlessly at empty doorways, hackles raised. And every child in the village, without exception, woke screaming from the same dream. A man without a face, walking silently through the air homes at 3:12. The mayor called a meeting in the town square, his voice trembling as he spoke. He urged calm, suggesting the phenomenon was nothing more than coincidence. "Clocks break," he said. "Springs slip. Pendulums falter. There is no curse, no devilry here." But as he tried to reassure his neighbors, the crowd's eyes drifted to the clock tower behind him. Its iron hands had not moved since the night of the event. They remained fixed, looming above the square like a silent reminder of time's betrayal. The older villagers began to speak in hushed tones about omens, about God's wrath, about unnatural visitations. A widow recalled stories from her grandmother of villages cursed to fall out of time, where souls wandered lost while the living pretended nothing had changed. Others muttered of spirits, of demons testing the faith of mankind. By the end of the meeting, one thing was clear. This was no simple malfunction. It was an event, deliberate, terrifying, and perhaps inescapable. And though the sun set and rose as it always had, the people of the village no longer trusted its light. For if every clock had died at 3:12, then perhaps time itself had abandoned them. By the end of the week, the village could no longer hide its fear. What had begun as murmurs in kitchens and whispers in alleyways erupted into full-blown panic. It was not just the clocks anymore, it was the feeling that something unseen was watching. The baker's wife was the first to leave. She packed her children onto a sled and vanished into the forests before dawn, muttering that she would rather freeze in the wilderness than stay another night beneath the eyes of the thing that walks at 3:12. By the next morning, 2 more families followed, abandoning homes that had stood for generations. Their absence left dark windows staring like hollow eyes across the snowbound streets. The church became the center of the unrest. Each evening, townsfolk gathered inside its wooden walls, candles trembling in their hands. The priest read from Revelation, his voice rising with each passage. "For the angel swore by him that liveth forever and ever, that there should be time no longer." His words struck fear more than comfort. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men bowed their heads, not in prayer, but in dread. Meanwhile, strange happenings spread like wildfire. Farmers found their roosters crowing at midnight instead of dawn. A schoolteacher reported the blackboard chalk writing words by itself, 3:12 scratched again and again in crooked lines. A shopkeeper claimed he awoke to find footprints in the snow outside his home, leading straight to his door, yet stopping just before the threshold, as if the visitor had stood watching for hours. The most unsettling accounts came from those who couldn't sleep. They swore that at exactly 3:12 each night, the village changed. The silence grew so heavy it pressed on the chest, making it impossible to breathe. Some claimed they heard the faint ticking of clocks, not their broken machines, but clocks hidden somewhere deeper, ting all at once before stopping in unison. Others said they glimpsed figures drifting between the houses, tall, thin shapes, faceless and soundless, moving like shadows detached from their owners. Children began refusing to go to bed. They cried that the clockmen were coming for them, that if they closed their eyes at 3:12, they would never wake again. Parents tried to soothe them, but the cries only grew more hysterical as night fell. One little girl, only 6 years old, whispered to her mother, "They want us to be still like them." Panic soon infected even the most rational. The blacksmith, who once prided himself on reason, was seen hammering crosses out of iron and nailing them to doors. The schoolteacher locked her pupils inside the classroom, insisting that learning by daylight would protect them from the dark hours. By the month's end, the village was no longer a place of order, but of terror. Families barricaded their homes, doors remained locked, and every night as 3:12 approached, the streets grew so quiet that even the snowflakes seemed to fall without sound. The people waited, breath held, hearts pounding, for time to stop again. Not everyone had been asleep when the clocks died at 3:12 a.m. A handful of villagers scattered across the town claimed to have been awake in that moment, and their stories would forever mark the event as something far darker than broken gears and frozen pendulums. The first to speak was an elderly farmer named Elias. He confessed that insomnia had kept him by his fire that night, his old bones aching in the bitter cold. At exactly 3:12, he said, the flames in his hearth flickered blue, as if starved of air, then froze still, not extinguished, not burning, but perfectly motionless, a painting of fire trapped in time. His body stiffened in terror. Though he could move, everything around him seemed suspended. Outside his window, the snow hung mid-fall, flakes suspended like glass beads in the air. Then slowly, he noticed shapes moving between them. Not people, not animals, but shadows gliding against a world that had stopped. Another account came from the midwife, a woman named Clara. She told the priest that she awoke gasping, convinced someone was sitting on her chest. She looked at her clock, 3:12. The hands did not move. When she turned her head, she saw figures standing in the corners of her bedroom, tall, faceless, watching. She swore their heads tilted in unison when she looked at them, as though mocking her fear. When she screamed, her husband did not stir. She shook him violently, but he was frozen, eyes half open, lips parted mid-breath. She alone could move. She alone could see. The third testimony was the most unsettling. A boy of 9 named Samuel said he had been awake, unable to sleep. He described hearing a sound above the village, like glass breaking forever. When he looked outside, he saw men walking backward through the snow, retracing their steps, unmaking their footprints as they moved. He said their mouths opened and closed, but no sound came, only silence. Later, when shown drawings of people, Samuel shook his head. They weren't people. They were copies. Skeptics in the village tried to dismiss these tales as hysteria, the result of fear and sleepless nights. But what made their accounts impossible to ignore was that they all described the same moment. The suffocating silence, the glass-shattering sound, the shadows that seemed to move when nothing else could. Worse still were the journals left behind by those who later vanished. One diary, written by a schoolteacher, stopped abruptly mid-sentence at 3:12. I hear it again outside my window. The sound is like... Nothing followed. The ink trailed off, as though her hand had been pulled away. By now, the villagers no longer spoke of coincidence, they spoke of survival. The ones who had seen the truth were shunned, pitied, even feared, because if they were telling the truth, then what walked the streets at 3:12 was not of this world. And every night, more villagers swore they too began to notice it. By the second Sunday after the clocks froze, the church overflowed. Families packed the wooden pews, candles flickering in trembling hands, their breaths visible in the cold air. Children clung to their mothers, and men sat stiff, jaws clenched, refusing to meet one another's eyes. They had gathered for answers, for hope, for some explanation of why their world had stopped at 3:12 a.m. Father Laurent, the village priest, stepped onto the altar. His black robe seemed heavier than usual, as though weighed down by what he carried in his heart. When he spoke, his voice cracked not with age, but with fear. He began with scripture, from the book of Revelation. And the angel swore by him that liveth forever and ever, who created heaven, and the things that therein are, and the earth, and the things that therein are, and the sea, and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer. The words fell like stones into the silence. Some wept, others crossed themselves, whispering prayers under their breath. The priest paused, then spoke what many already feared. Brothers and sisters, what happened here is not natural. It is not science. It is not chance. At 3:12, heaven itself passed over us, and we were found wanting. Gasps filled the church. A woman fainted. The baker shouted that they had done nothing to deserve such judgment, but Father Laurent shook his head. The Lord does not make mistakes. If time has died here, it is because sin lives here. He began naming them aloud: drunkards, adulterers, those who skipped mass, those who quarreled, lied, or stole. Each word drove the villagers deeper into paranoia. Neighbors began glaring at one another, whispering accusations. Husbands gripped their wives' hands tighter, as if to shield them from sudden exposure. Then the priest made his final declaration, his voice rising like thunder. if we do not repent. If we do not cleanse this village of sin, then 312 will come again. And next time it will not be the clocks that stop. It will be our souls. That night, hysteria spread like wildfire. Families scrubbed their homes, tearing down paintings, smashing bottles of liquor, burning letters and keepsakes they feared might be sinful. Mothers beat their children into prayer, forcing them to kneel until their knees bled. Men patrolled the streets with lanterns, daring shadows to show themselves. The priest himself became a figure of both guidance and terror. Some clung to him as their only hope, others whispered that he had invited this curse with his endless sermons of judgment, but no one dared defy him, not after his warning. At midnight, the church bells rang on their own, though their gears, like all others, were dead. The sound carried across the village, low and hollow, like a funeral toll. And when the bells fell silent, the villagers swore they could hear another sound creeping in their place, the faint ticking of unseen clocks, growing louder, closer, until the night froze again. Word of the frozen clocks did not remain hidden within the snowbound valley for long. A traveling merchant, unnerved by the whispers and the dead timepieces he saw with his own eyes, carried the story beyond the forests. Within weeks, officials from Ottawa arrived, men in heavy coats, their cars hissing steam as they pulled into the village square. They introduced themselves as investigators, but their clipped speech and hard stares betrayed something colder. They carried no warmth of sympathy, only the discipline of orders. Accompanying them were scientists, pale, bespectacled men who spoke in jargon the villagers could not understand. The first thing they did was confiscate watches, clocks, broken pendulums, journals, even the blackboard from the school that had mysteriously written 312 across itself. Villagers who resisted were threatened. The blacksmith, proud and defiant, refused to hand over his great iron clock. That evening, soldiers escorted him from his home. He was never seen again. At night, the officials worked in secrecy. Villagers peered from their windows and saw lanterns glowing in the church and the clock tower. Strange instruments were wheeled in, tripods with glass tubes, boxes humming with low electrical currents, cameras that clicked but produced no photographs. They spoke little to the villagers, except to warn, "Do not speak of this outside. Do not interfere." But the villagers did not need to hear their words to sense the truth. The men were afraid. Witnesses claimed that on the first night, one of the scientists ran screaming from the clock tower, eyes wide, shouting, "It's still ticking," before he was dragged back inside by his colleagues. Within days, entire families were ordered to leave their homes while investigators conducted tests. Furniture was overturned, floorboards pried up, wells drained. When the families returned, they found the signs of intrusion unmistakable, but their clocks, their most personal relics, were gone. Even the ones locked away in trunks had been taken. Then the disappearances began. Quiet, careful, never acknowledged. A farmer who claimed to have seen shadows moving at 312 vanished from his barn. A school teacher who tried to send letters to relatives was said to have fallen ill, yet no funeral was ever held. Those who asked questions received no answers. When the villagers demanded to know what the officials had discovered, they were met with silence. Reports, if they existed, never reached the public. Every scrap of evidence, the stopped clocks, the children's drawings, the diaries that ended mid-sentence, was boxed up, loaded into trucks, and driven out of the village under cover of snow. Weeks later, the officials departed as abruptly as they had come. They left no explanations, no reassurances, not even a promise of return. The villagers stood in silence as the vehicles disappeared into the white horizon, leaving behind nothing but unease. But one thing was certain. Whatever those men had seen, whatever they had taken, they feared it enough to bury it. And the villagers understood then what perhaps they had always known. Their curse was not meant to be solved. It was meant to be hidden. Long after the officials left, the village children began to speak more openly. At first, their parents silenced them, scolding them for imagining things. But children do not carry fear the way adults do. Their words came out in whispers, drawings, and sudden cries in the night. And what they described chilled the village more deeply than any sermon or government warning ever could. The first clues appeared in the schoolhouse. While cleaning the desks, the teacher discovered sketchbooks stuffed beneath the floorboards. Crude drawings filled the pages. Stick figures with hollow faces, families standing around frozen clocks, black shapes hovering over rooftops. The word 312 was scribbled again and again, written so obsessively it tore holes through the paper. When questioned, the children admitted they had seen things that night, things their parents could not. They spoke of men walking backward through the snow, leaving no footprints behind. They described doorways glowing faintly, as if something beyond was trying to break through. One boy swore he saw his father standing in the yard, unmoving, though his father had been asleep inside the house at the time. The most unsettling testimony came from a girl named Margaret. She was only 8, yet her words carried the weight of someone far older. She claimed that at 3:12 she had heard whispers in her ear, voices layered over one another, speaking in languages she did not know. When she covered her ears, the voices grew louder, repeating a single phrase she did understand. "Be still, with us." Another group of children admitted they had been playing a game in the church basement when the event occurred. They described time freezing, the candles turning solid, dust hanging motionless in the air, but said they could still move. Terrified, they huddled together, but then noticed others moving too. Not people, not Viet, lagers, copies of themselves, pale, blurred versions that walked stiffly across the room before dissolving into the shadows. Parents tried to dismiss these stories as nightmares, childish inventions. But the drawings continued. Even children too young to write scrawled clocks and dark figures on walls, in the snow, even on their own skin with bits of coal. When asked why, they would only answer, "Because they told us to remember." Some adults began to wonder if the children were closer to the truth than anyone else. They were innocent, unguarded, untouched by the rational mind that rejects the impossible. Perhaps they had seen what the grown could not, or worse, what the grown were never meant to see. One night, the teacher found Margaret awake at her desk, scratching another drawing into her book. When asked why she couldn't sleep, the child looked up, her eyes wide, unblinking. "Because they come back every night," she said softly. "And one day, they will stop asking us to be still. They will make us." From that moment on, the children were no longer seen as innocent. They were witnesses, messengers, and to some, they were living proof that the village belonged not to its people, but to the thing that claimed it at 3:12. By the following spring, the village had grown quieter than ever. Not because life had returned to normal, it hadn't, but because it felt as though the world beyond the forest had decided the place no longer existed. It began with the mail. Letters sent to relatives never arrived, packages ordered never came. Carriers who once trudged through the snow to deliver news and goods now stopped visiting altogether. When villagers traveled to nearby towns to ask why, they were met with blank stares. "That village," locals said. "There's no such place. Not on the maps. Not anymore." And it was true. The mayor, desperate for proof, purchased a brand new atlas. He turned page after page, searching for their name printed on the northern routes. It was gone. Where once their valley had been clearly marked, there was only a patch of unbroken white. Soon, other signs appeared. Newspapers that had once published stories about the frozen clocks suddenly contained blank spaces where the articles should have been, the columns cut out or replaced with irrelevant news. School records for children who had transferred vanished. Birth certificates, property deeds, even church registries were reported missing by the regional offices. To the outside world, the village had been carefully erased, as though it had never been. But the villagers knew better. They remembered the trucks that had carried away their clocks. They remembered the officials who warned them not to speak. It seemed the erasure was no accident, it was deliberate. The curse of 3:12 was not to be studied or understood, it was to be buried. Still, there were traces that could not be hidden so easily. A young woman traveled to Toronto in 1931, desperate to escape, only to return weeks later, pale and silent. She refused to say what had happened, only that every time she introduced herself, people looked at her as though she had invented her own name. Even when she showed them her papers, they insisted they were forgeries. "You don't exist," they said. "Not here." Another villager, determined to preserve their history, tried to publish a book about the frozen clocks. He worked by candlelight, compiling every testimony, every detail. But when he carried his manuscript to a publisher in Montreal, the pages inside his satchel were blank. Every word, every drawing, every line of ink had vanished, leaving only empty sheets bound in string. The villagers began to understand the truth. Not only had their clocks stopped, but their very place in the world was being unmade. They were alive, yes, but they were being erased, stripped from memory, carved from history, reduced to whispers in the snow. One chilling rumor spread among the children that the figures who walked at 312 weren't visitors at all. They were collectors. And what they were collecting wasn't clocks or journals or even people. They were collecting time itself. And when they were finished, nothing would remain of the village at all. Decades passed. By the 1950s, the village had thinned to only a scattering of families, many of them too poor or too frightened to leave. The forest slowly reclaimed abandoned homes. Roofs caved in, barns collapsed into fields of weeds, and the church bell, once the heartbeat of the community, rusted silently in its tower. But one woman refused to let the place die entirely. Her name was Eleanor Grant, a teacher who had been just 22 the night the clocks froze. She lived long enough to see 3 generations born and buried in that valley, and though she rarely spoke of it, she carried the memory of 312 like a sickness inside her. It wasn't until 1976, in the final months of her life, that she agreed to be interviewed. A historian, intrigued by rumors of a vanished Canadian town, tracked her down in a nursing home in Ontario. When he asked about the frozen clocks, Eleanor did not laugh or dismiss him, as so many had before. She leaned forward in her wheelchair, her hands trembling, and said, "You want to know the truth? Then I will give it to you. But once you hear it, you'll never forget, and you'll wish you had." Her account was chilling. Eleanor claimed that the event had never ended. The clocks had not simply stopped once, they continued to stop. Every year on the same night, at the same exact minute. 3:12 a.m. The difference was that after the first time, the phenomenon was no longer confined to the clocks. It spread to people. She described how, in the years that followed, more and more villagers would simply freeze where they stood at 3:12, their bodies stiff, their eyes vacant. Some would come back minutes later, dazed and confused, swearing they had been dreaming of walking through endless halls of mirrors. Others never came back at all. Their bodies would remain locked in place, as though the moment itself had consumed them. Worse, Eleanor insisted that the children, the ones who had seen the copies of themselves, had been telling the truth. She said she had watched her students vanish at their desks during lessons, only to return seconds later with scratches on their arms, as if something had clawed at them in the dark. One boy came back missing 2 of his teeth. A girl returned with her braids cut off, though no scissors had ever touched them. The historian pressed her. Who or what was behind it? Eleanor shook her head. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They are not from here. They are not of us. They are patient. And they are collecting. When asked what they were collecting, she stared out the window for a long time before answering. Time, she said finally, and the pieces of us that live inside it. The historian recorded her words, but when he returned home, he discovered his tapes had warped, the sound garbled, Eleanor's voice stretched and distorted until it resembled nothing human. Only a single phrase remained clear, repeated over and over, as though she had spoken it directly into the machine. 3:12, be still with us. By the late 1980s, almost nothing remained of the village. The last few families who stayed behind described a constant heaviness in the air, as if the valley itself were holding its breath. The trees grew thicker, leaning inward like ribs closing over a wound. Roads that once led to the village grew over with moss and grass until they looked less like paths and more like scars being erased from the land. The last written account came from a provincial surveyor in 1989. Tasked with updating land records, he hiked into the valley with maps and measuring tools. His report, filed hastily in pencil, described collapsed farmhouses, broken fences, and one church steeple that leaned like a crooked finger toward the sky. But what unsettled him most was the clocks. Even after decades, he found them in nearly every ruin, shattered, rusting, buried in the snowdrifts. But each one was stopped at the exact same time. 3:12. The surveyor never returned for a second visit. His belongings were later discovered at a bus depot, but his body was never found. After that, stories of the village dwindled to nothing. By the mid-1990s, even aerial photographs of the area revealed nothing but unbroken forest. No ruins, no roads, no trace of human settlement. It was as though the earth had closed its mouth and swallowed the valley whole. But not everyone believed it was gone. A handful of hikers claimed to stumble across the place by accident, finding foundations of homes or the outline of a street beneath layers of pine needles. One group swore they heard a bell ringing faintly in the distance, though there was no church to be seen. And in more chilling reports, some claimed to see figures standing among the trees, perfectly still, as though caught between 1 second and the next. The last true sighting came from a truck driver in 1998. Passing along a highway that skirted the old foe, Rest, he glanced into the dark pines and saw for a fraction of a moment a glowing clock face staring back at him, not broken, not rusted, glowing, its hands frozen at 3:12. When he looked again, it was gone. Since then, the village has become a rumor, a ghost story whispered in logging camps and truck stops. Some say it never existed at all, that it was nothing more than an invention of frightened settlers, but others believe it is still there, not erased, but trapped, existing in a sliver of time that repeats endlessly, waiting for the rest of the world to join it. And perhaps that is the true horror. Not that a village disappeared, but that it still exists somewhere, locked at 3:12, its people frozen forever in silence, waiting, watching, collecting. The forest holds the secret close, the air still heavy, the silence still absolute. And if you should ever wander deep enough to hear the faint ticking of a clock that should not exist, do not look for where it comes from, because if you do, you may never leave.